The rain wasn't just falling. It was hammering the ocean like 1,000 fists. Out on the horizon, the sky was a jagged wall of black and silver, lightning tearing through it in violent flashes. Somewhere beyond that chaos, a small SEAL team was pinned down, their radios crackling with desperate coordinates. And then, in the middle of the static, came a voice, calm, steady, unshaken. Hog 1 approaching target. No one could see her yet, but every man on that beach knew the sound that was about to cut through the storm. Welcome back to the Storyscape. Before we dive in, I have to ask, where are you watching from today? Let me know in the comments, because your stories, your perspectives, they shape the way we tell ours. And if this is your first time here, this is the place where we bring you cinematic, high-stakes stories of courage, impossible odds, and the people who step forward when no one else can. The South Pacific could be beautiful, postcard perfect even, but not today. By late afternoon, the horizon was a bruised smear of black and violet, the ocean churning beneath it like molten glass. A humid wind pressed against the skin, heavy with the smell of salt and the metallic tang that always came before a storm. The temperature had dropped just enough to make the air feel unstable, restless. It wasn't a place anyone wanted to be without cover. And for the small SEAL reconnaissance team moving silently along a narrow strip of jungle-covered coastline, there was no cover to be found. Their mission had been simple in theory: land by rigid-hull inflatable boat, conduct a brief reconnaissance of a suspected weapons cache, and exfiltrate without being detected. But the theory had dissolved the moment they stepped ashore. The village they expected to be abandoned wasn't, and it wasn't just occupied, it was fortified. Gunfire had broken out in the first 5 minutes. Now, crouched in the sand behind broken palm trunks and jagged coral, the SEALs were pinned down by overlapping fields of fire from the tree line. 50 miles to the west, Captain Alexandra Ward sat in the cockpit of her A-10 Thunderbolt II, watching the storm close in. Her aircraft, affectionately nicknamed the Warthog, was an ugly, beautiful thing. Straight wings that looked too wide, twin turbofan engines mounted high on the tail, a fuselage built around a 30mm GAU-8 Avenger cannon that could shred a tank in seconds. It was not sleek like an F-16, nor fast like an F-15, but it was built to survive what other planes could not. Falcon knew this better than anyone. She had once limped an A-10 home with a hole the size of a refrigerator in her wing. The canopy above her head offered a wide-angle view of the ocean, but that view was now fragmented. Below, the water was a restless slate gray, whipped into whitecaps. Above, layers of dark cloud piled over each other like mountains, flashes of lightning illuminating their jagged contours. The radar screen glowed dimly against the darkened cockpit, showing both the approaching storm front and the coordinates relayed by the JTAC on the ground. Falcon was a seasoned combat pilot, her record dotted with missions in Afghanistan, Iraq, and other places she'd never name aloud. Her flight hours numbered over 2,000, most logged at altitudes where a single mistake could put her in range of small arms fire. She'd mastered the pylon turn, a maneuver that allowed the A-10 to orbit a target while keeping the GAU-8 trained on it, to the point where other pilots came to her for advice. She'd learned to trust the titanium armor that wrapped the cockpit, to trust her own judgment even when visibility dropped to nothing. She didn't consider herself reckless, though others had used that word. She preferred deliberate. Every dive, every strafing run, every low-altitude pass was calculated. shaped by years of knowing exactly how far she could push her machine without crossing the line between courage and suicide. In the middle of this calculation, the call came through. On the beach, JTAC Sergeant Dean Marshall pressed himself into the sand, the roar of incoming fire a constant in his ears. He held the radio mic close to his mouth, speaking in a low, deliberate tone to keep the tremor out of his voice. Requesting immediate CAS, danger close, target grid. He rattled off the numbers, his eyes flicking between his GPS and the muzzle flashes in the tree line. Inside Falcon's cockpit, the coordinates appeared instantly on her heads-up display. Her gloved fingers moved across the HOTAS controls, selecting the appropriate weapons profile, checking her ammunition count. 1,100 rounds of 30mm HEI and API mixed, more than enough to make a difference if she could get there in time. Her gaze shifted back to the horizon, where the storm was now swallowing the last scraps of daylight. She thumbed the radio. Hog 1 copies. I'm inbound. Mark target if possible. The JTAC's voice crackled back. Negative on visual mark. Too much cover. You'll have to run it on IR. Falcon's jaw tightened. Infrared targeting through a storm this dense would be difficult. The heavy rain and turbulence would play havoc with sensor clarity, but she had no choice. She banked slightly, bringing the nose of the A-10 toward the storm's edge and pushed the throttles forward. The engines roared behind her, their steady whine as familiar as her own heartbeat. The A-10 didn't slice through the air so much as muscle its way forward, and in moments like this, Falcon was grateful for that brute persistence. As the clouds loomed larger, lightning arced across the sky, briefly turning the cockpit into a flash-lit chamber of glass and steel. She adjusted her seat, checked her oxygen flow, and tightened the straps across her shoulders. Beneath her boots, she could feel the subtle vibration of the GAU-8, a sleeping predator waiting for its cue. Down on the beach, the SEALs stayed low, their weapons pointed toward the jungle. They couldn't hear her yet, but they knew she was coming. And for them, that was enough. The first raindrops struck the canopy like pebbles, sharp and fast. Within seconds, they became a solid sheet of water, distorting the horizon into a shifting blur. Falcon toggled the windshield wipers, a rare necessity for most combat aircraft, but on the A-10, every design choice served a purpose. The wipers cleared the glass just long enough for her to see the storm's black wall rising ahead, its base dragging across the ocean like a curtain of smoke. She flicked her eyes to the multifunction display. The IR feed was already grainy, the heat signatures muddled by the storm's density. She switched filters, dialing up the contrast, looking for anything. The sharp line of a tree line, the brief flare of muzzle flash. On the ground, Sergeant Marshall knew they were running out of time. The enemy fire had shifted, no longer sporadic bursts, but sustained volleys. Tracer rounds arced in from the jungle, red and green streaks cutting through the rain. One of his men had taken a round in the shoulder, not fatal, but enough to slow their retreat. Marshall keyed the mic, voice tight. Hog 1, be advised, we are dangered close at 200 meters from enemy positions. We're on the south edge of the inlet. Falcon processed the information instantly. Danger close meant she'd have to run her strafing pass with surgical precision. Even a fraction of a degree off, and her rounds could hit friendlies. She'd done it before. She could do it again. But not in this weather. Not without full focus. The turbulence hit her like a shove. The A-10's wide wings caught the gust, tilting the aircraft hard to starboard. Falcon corrected with practiced ease, rolling level without losing altitude. Her hand stayed light on the stick, letting the plane ride the wind instead of fighting it head-on. She adjusted her throttle, keeping the speed steady at 300 knots, slow enough to maneuver, fast enough to stay unpredictable to any ground fire that might try to reach her through the storm. Lightning forked across the clouds again, and for a split second, the coastline came into view. Jagged rock, a narrow strip of sand, and behind it, the dark smear of jungle. She could almost imagine the SEAL team there, pressed into the wet sand, waiting for the sound of her engines. She flipped the master arm switch to on. The panel lit up. Gun, armed, HUD, live, ammo, 1100. She ran through the checklist in her mind. Wind direction, attack heading, pull-out vector. Every factor was a moving part in a delicate equation. She couldn't just attack, she had to attack in a way that ensured the SEALs lived to leave that beach. Hog 1, copy last transmission, she said, her voice even. Hold position. Mark will be IR search. Marshall acknowledged, his tone clipped but steady. Holding. We'll light the IR strobe when you're in range. The storm swallowed her completely. Visibility dropped to nothing. No sea, no sky, just the gray void. The engines were a constant drone behind her, but even they seemed muffled by the roar of the rain against the fuselage. The vibration through the airframe changed subtly. She was now flying in air thick with moisture, every surface of the aircraft coated in a thin skin of water. She adjusted her altitude, dropping to 1,500 feet. Low enough to break through the worst of the cloud base, high enough to give her a margin if she needed to pull up fast. She kept her eyes on the radar, now more critical than her forward view, tracing the contour of the island ahead. Then she saw it. A flicker in the IR feed, faint but distinct. The JTAC strobe. It wasn't bright, it wasn't clean, but it was there. A small, pulsing point in the static chaos. Falcon banked left, lining up for her first pass. The GAU-8 was ready. She could almost feel the latent weight of it beneath her, the way the whole plane would shudder when it fired. She switched her display to the gun camera, confirming the range. 2,000 meters. Closing. She eased the throttle forward, the engines responding with a deep, rising growl. Her focus narrowed to a tunnel. Target, line, trigger. The rest, the storm, the lightning, the turbulence, became background noise. On the beach, Marshall heard it before he saw it. A low building thunder that wasn't the sky. The sound grew until it seemed to vibrate through the ground beneath him. He glanced up just in time to see the dark silhouette of the A-10 burst from the wall of rain, its wings level, nose down. "She's here," someone murmured beside him, awe cutting through the tension. The moment Falcon crossed the shoreline, the island's shape unfolded beneath her like a three-dimensional map burned into her mind. The beach was a narrow ribbon of pale sand, bordered by jagged rock, its edges blurring under the driving rain. Beyond it, the jungle rose like a living wall, dense and shadowed even in the lightning's brief illumination. Somewhere in that darkness were the muzzle flashes she needed to silence. She leveled her wings, nose pointed directly toward the IR strobe's faint pulse. The A-10's HUD calculated range and angle in green numerals that seemed to float in the rain-washed glass. Her gloved thumb rested lightly on the trigger paddle. The GAU-8 Avenger cannon, 7 barrels of 30mm armor-piercing hate, was spooled and waiting. When it fired, it wouldn't sound like a machine gun. It would sound like tearing the sky itself. She began her dive, throttle pulled back just enough to stabilize the descent without overspeeding. Wind buffeted the aircraft, rain hammering the canopy so hard it blurred the edges of the target area. Her breathing slowed, heart rate dropping to that focused zone she'd trained for, the world collapsing into numbers, angles, and instinct. At 1,200 meters, she squeezed the trigger. The A-10 shuddered with each round, the recoil so powerful it felt like the plane was trying to stop in midair. On the ground, the sound arrived as a single guttural roar. Brrrt, echoing off the jungle and drowned only briefly by the impact of the rounds. Shells tore into the tree line, exploding into bursts of splintered wood, dirt, and tangled foliage.
Muzzle flashes vanished, replaced by the chaos of branches and debris whipping into the air. Sergeant Marshall ducked instinctively, though the rounds were slicing into the jungle 200 meters ahead. He'd called in airstrikes before, but nothing matched the sheer physical presence of a warthog strafing run. The air seemed to thicken with concussion, the ground vibrating under each impact. Even over the storm, the GAU-8's voice was unmistakable, its cadence an unbroken chain of destruction. Falcon held the trigger for a precise 3-second burst, then eased off, pulling the nose up just as she reached her safe breakpoint. Her pull-out vector took her over the beach and back out toward open water. The G-forces pressed her into the seat as she climbed through the cloud base, rain still streaking sideways across the canopy. She checked her ammo readout, 920 rounds remaining. Plenty for another pass, maybe 2 if she managed them cleanly. She keyed her mic. Hog 1, 1 pass complete, confirm effect on target. Marshall's voice came back over the static, breathless but steady. Solid hit. Enemy fire reduced but not out. Recommend repeat. Copy, re-engaging. Falcon banked left into a wide, sweeping turn, keeping low enough to stay under the worst turbulence. Her eyes scanned the IR feed, now showing fewer flashes in the tree line, but still some stubborn points of resistance. She can almost feel the SEAL team's urgency through the radio. Every second they spent pinned down increased their risk of taking casualties. She brought the A-10 around, the storm's edge flickering with distant lightning. Her hands were steady on the HOTAS, the subtle adjustment second nature now. She aligned with her ingress vector again, this time coming in from a slightly steeper angle to punch through the remaining positions. The GAU-8's arming light glowed an almost reassuring amber. Down on the sand, one of Marshall's men risked the glance over their improvised cover. Through the curtain of rain, the dark silhouette of the warthog emerged again, low and deliberate, the engine's distinctive whine building.
Even the enemy fighters must have heard it by now, a sound that often meant their fight was already lost. At 1,500 meters, Falcon toggled to API-only fire, maximizing penetration through the jungle's dense cover. Her targeting pipper locked over the faintest IR flicker, a stubborn enemy position that had survived the first run. She rolled slightly to offset crosswind drift and squeezed the trigger again. Brrrr. The second pass was faster, more punishing. Each round ripped into the tree line, chewing through cover and scattering earth in geysers. The smell of cordite and splintered wood drifted out even through the rain, mixing with the tang of ozone from the storm. When she pulled up this time, the IR feed showed nothing but heat haze where the enemy had been. She released the trigger, climbing back into the gray void. Engine steady, ammo count reading 86. Hog 1, target neutralized, Marshall confirmed. There was relief in his tone, but no celebration yet. They still had to make it out. Falcon throttled back, holding a high orbit just offshore. Her eyes scanned the moving wall of clouds, watching for anything that might threaten the extraction. She wasn't leaving until they were safely on the boat. The first wave of enemy fire had gone silent, but Falcon knew better than to believe it was over. On the ground, the SEAL team was moving, fast, low, and in tight formation, across the open strip of sand toward their extraction point. The boat, a low-profile, rigid-hull inflatable, was waiting just beyond the surf, its crew scanning the tree line for any last desperate counterattack. But the storm wasn't easing. If anything, it was worsening. Sheets of rain swept sideways, bending the palm fronds until they nearly touched the ground. Wind gusts came in sudden punches, strong enough to rock the A-10 even in her stable orbit. The sky had turned into a living bruise, mottled black and violet, lit from within by erratic flashes of lightning. Falcon's comms crackled with Marshall's voice. "We're moving. Cover south quadrant. Possible stragglers in the tree line." "Copy," she replied, already banking into position. Her targeting systems were still live, HUD painting faint residual heat blooms in the jungle's edge. One signature in particular made her narrow her eyes, small, flickering, but moving fast along the foliage line. Her thumb hovered over the trigger, but she hesitated. Too close to the team, she needed a cleaner shot. Instead, she dropped to 800 feet, engines screaming in the dense air, making a deliberate low pass over the suspected area. Sometimes the sound of the warthog was as effective as its gun, a reminder to any survivor that the sky was watching. Her flyover kicked up spray from the surf, sending white plumes into the air and rattling the leaves below. On the beach, Marshall caught sight of the movement, a lone fighter breaking from the tree line, rifle in hand.
Before the men could aim, the sound of the A-10 overhead made him falter, just long enough for one of the SEALs to drop him with 2 precise shots. They didn't stop moving. The team reached the surf line just as the storm threw its next punch. A massive swell rolled in, hitting the shoreline like a wall, drenching everyone to the bone and knocking one man to his knees. The boat crew lunged forward, grabbing gear and arms, hauling the SEALs in 2 at a time. Falcon circled wider, eyes on both the extraction zone and the deeper jungle. Her radar pinged a blip, small, erratic, moving offshore. Could be debris in the water, could be something else. "Extraction in progress," Marshall reported between bursts of static. 2 mics to clear. She adjusted her orbit, keeping herself between the storm's leading edge and the extraction point. If anything tried to push through that weather, they'd meet her first. Her mind kept running contingencies. If a small boat appeared, if more enemy fighters broke cover, if the storm knocked out their comms entirely. She'd been in situations where those ifs turned real without warning. Lightning tore open the sky directly above her, so bright it lit the entire cockpit in white. The thunder followed instantly, a concussive slam that seemed to shake the aircraft's frame. Her instruments flickered, just for a second, but enough to make her heart skip. She checked her systems quickly, avionics stable, weapons armed, engines holding steady. She dipped her nose toward the extraction zone again, just in time to see the last of the SEALs clamber into the boat. The outboard engines roared, and the craft turned sharply toward open water, its bow punching through the churning waves. "Package secure," Marshall's voice came through, the relief finally breaking in. "We're clear." Falcon didn't relax yet. She pulled into a parallel course with the boat, flying low and just ahead of their path. Her presence was a shield. If anything came after them, she'd intercept before it got close. The storm was shifting now, sliding over the island and out toward the open sea, but its tail was still vicious. Rain lashed against her canopy in uneven bursts, and the wind forced her to make constant micro-corrections to stay level. She glanced at her ammo counter, 860 rounds still in the feed, and kept the master arm hot, just in case. For the next 5 minutes, she flew that Escort, the boat's white wake a clear line beneath her. Only when the coastline was a fading smudge behind them and the storm's roar was muted by distance did she finally ease back on the throttle. "Hog 1, RTB. And thanks." Falcon allowed herself the smallest smile. "Just doing my job." She banked toward base, the ocean below still restless, the storm, behind her, still raging.
But the men she'd been sent to protect were alive, and that was the only measure that mattered. The storm was behind her now, but it wasn't gone. Even at 20 miles out, Falcon could still see its roiling mass in her rearview mirrors, an angry bruise spreading across the horizon. Lightning forked within it, muted by distance, like the last growls of a beast retreating into its cave. Her A-10 rode the calmer air smoothly now, though the occasional gust still nudged the nose just enough to keep her on her toes. The cockpit was quiet, save for the steady hum of the twin General Electric TF-34 engines and the faint hiss of the environmental systems. In the aftermath of combat, that silence was always the strangest part, like stepping out of a concert into a deserted street at midnight. No gunfire, no radio urgency, just her and the machine, carrying the faint smell of cordite and rain-dampened metal. Falcon ran her post-engagement checks with the same precision she'd practiced 1,000 times. Fuel, 3,200 pounds remaining, plenty for RTB with margin. Ammo, 860 rounds left in the GAU-8 drum. Hydraulics, nominal. Avionics, stable, though one of her HUD elements was flickering from a possible moisture intrusion. She logged it mentally for the ground crew. The sun, low in the western sky, broke through a gap in the clouds, painting the ocean in streaks of gold and silver. Her visor shielded her eyes, but the light was still sharp enough to cut through the fatigue settling in her muscles. She flexed her fingers on the stick, working out the tension. Her mind replayed the mission in fragments. The first sight of the IR strobe, the tree line erupting under her first burst, the flash of movement that could have turned deadly for the SEALs if she'd been a second slower. A chirp from the radio broke the stillness. It was Marshall. Their boat had made rendezvous with a Navy fast transport and was already heading for open sea. No injuries, no losses. "You've got a lot of fans here," he added. His voice carried that mix of exhaustion and relief that only came after surviving something close. She didn't answer immediately. Compliments always felt unplaced in the cockpit. Finally, she keyed the mic. "Roger that. Safe travels." The rest of the flight was navigation and routine. She checked in with ATC, received vector clearance back to the forward operating base, and began a slow descent toward the coastline. From above, the airfield looked like a thin strip of gray carved into the green, surrounded by hangars, fuel trucks, and the scurrying dots of maintenance crews. Wind was steady from the east at 12 knots, crosswind component negligible. She lined up for final approach, gear down, flaps set, airspeed bleeding off in measured increments. The A-10's landing was as unhurried as everything else about the aircraft.
It touched down with a solid but controlled bump, the big tires hissing against the wet tarmac. Speed brakes deployed automatically, and she eased back on the throttles until the taxiway turnoff came into view. As she rolled toward her designated parking spot, the ground crew was already in position, yellow vests bright against the dull gray of the ramp. One of the crew chiefs, a wiry sergeant with reins still dripping from his headset, gave her a thumbs up as she powered down. She returned it with a nod, unstrapping from the harness and reaching for the canopy release. The canopy lifted, and the humid air rushed in, smelling of jet fuel and damp earth. Falcon climbed down the ladder, boots hitting the tarmac with a muted thud. The A-10 loomed behind her, streaked with rain, scorched faintly around the cannon ports, and marked with the subtle grime of a machine that had just done exactly what it was built for. She'd barely taken 3 steps when she spotted them. Marshall and 2 other SEALs, still in their soaked gear, were walking toward her from the operations building. They'd made it back faster than she expected, flown in by chopper after transferring from the boat. For a moment, no one said anything. They just stood there, the rain easing into a mist, the faint growl of distant thunder rolling over the base. Marshall was the first to speak. That first pass, he shook his head slightly, a grin breaking through the fatigue. "We thought we were done. Then you showed up." Falcon's reply was simple, almost reflexive. "That's what I'm here for." One of the younger SEALs, still carrying the jitter of adrenaline, stepped forward and extended a hand. She shook it briefly, the grip firm. There were no speeches, no grand declarations, just the quiet understanding between people who'd shared a moment where skill and timing had made all the difference. The ground crew began swarming the A-10, checking panels, refueling, rearming. Falcon glanced back once, watching as the crew chief inspected the GAU-8's barrels, still faintly warm. Tomorrow, the aircraft would be spotless again, ready for the next call. And when that call came,
she'd be ready too. For now, she walked toward the debriefing room, helmet tucked under her arm, the echoes of the storm fading behind her. The mission was over, but the memory of the jungle's tree line, the roar of the cannon, and the look on the SEALs' faces would stay with her. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Some storms you fly into because you have no choice. Others you fly into because someone's counting on you to break through. Night came slowly to the island base, the last traces of the storm dragging themselves across the horizon like tattered sails. The airfield glistened under the floodlights, every puddle reflecting the pale yellow glow in ripples as the wind teased the surface.
Falcon stood alone at the far edge of the ramp, helmet resting on the nose of her A-10, the metal still faintly warm from the day's sortie. The operations building had gone quiet after the debrief. The SEAL team was already gone, flown out on a transport to their next assignment, or maybe to a brief stretch of rest, if such a thing still existed for them. The debrief itself had been straightforward. Timeline of contact, weapons expended, weather interference, coordination logs. All the official boxes checked. But no piece of paper could capture what it had felt like inside that cockpit when the tree line came alive with muzzle flashes, or when the rain hammered the canopy so hard she could barely see the horizon. She traced a gloved hand along the A-10's fuselage, her fingertips following the streaks of grime and salt. The titanium armor beneath was cold now, but earlier it had been alive, vibrating with the deep growl of the GAU-8 Avenger and the twin TF-34 engines straining against the storm's grip. This aircraft wasn't sleek like the newer fighters, and it didn't climb like a rocket, but it could take a beating and keep flying, just like the people it was sent to protect. Her gaze drifted toward the control tower. Inside, a skeleton crew kept watch, monitoring radar scopes that swept the dark sea in rhythmic pulses. She knew the night shift would be quiet now, the storm having driven everything, friendly and otherwise, far from this stretch of ocean. Still, someone was always watching. That was the unspoken pact. From the shadows near the hangar, the crew chief approached, wiping his hands on a rag that was already black with grease. He stopped a few feet away. "She's good for tomorrow," he said, nodding toward the warthog. "The storm didn't faze her, or you." Falcon allowed herself a small smile. She did most of the work. The crew chief chuckled and stepped back, leaving her to the night. The engines were silent now, but she could still hear them in her head, the low, steady heartbeat that had been with her through every pass, every strafing run. It wasn't just a sound. It was a reminder that she wasn't out there alone. The aircraft had been built for this, to be the wall between danger and the people who had no one else to call. She walked a few paces to the edge of the tarmac, where the concrete gave way to the grassy perimeter of the base. Beyond it, the ocean stretched into the dark, only the faintest silver line marking where water met sky. Somewhere out there, the SEALs she'd covered were looking up at the same stars, maybe thinking about how close the day had come to going differently. Falcon tilted her head back, studying the constellations she'd learned to recognize as navigation points long before she'd ever flown combat.
The stars had been there, above the storm, even when she couldn't see them. That was another thing you learned in this line of work. Just because you couldn't see the clear sky didn't mean it wasn't there. Her thoughts drifted to the storm itself, the walls of rain, the blinding flashes, the way it had tried to shove her A-10 sideways like a leaf in a gutter.
Some pilots avoided weather like that, and for good reason. But for her, the storm had never been the enemy. It was simply another part of the mission, something to navigate, something to understand. The real enemy was always on the ground, where seconds decided whether people lived or died. The floodlights buzzed overhead, drawing her back from her thoughts. She took one last look at the warthog, its squat frame, its ungainly but purposeful lines, the shark mouth painted on the nose as if daring the world to try something. Tomorrow there might be another call, another team pinned down somewhere in the rain or the dust or the dark, and she would answer it. She picked up her helmet, feeling the familiar weight settle into her palm. It was more than just equipment. It was the threshold between the world on the ground and the world in the air, between waiting and acting. She slung it under her arm and began the walk back toward the barracks. Halfway there, she stopped and turned back one last time. The storm had fully passed now, leaving the air still and heavy, the moon breaking through the last ragged edge of cloud. Its light fell across the A-10's wings, turning them silver against the dark. It looked almost peaceful, but Falcon knew that under that calm skin was the kind of power that could change the outcome of a fight in less than a minute. Somewhere deep inside, she felt the familiar shift, the quiet acknowledgement that she'd done what she'd come here to do. It wasn't pride, not exactly. More like the steady hum of a job well done. The same hum she'd hear tomorrow when the engines spun up and the warthog rolled down the runway once again. She turned and kept walking, boots echoing on the wet concrete, the night swallowing the sound after a few steps. The base settled into its midnight rhythm, and out over the ocean the waves kept breaking, endless, patient, and unafraid, because storms always pass, and when they do, someone has to be ready to fly into the next one.